The door banged closed and roused Father Maxey from his doze. He'd been napping in the confessional booth and had honestly expected not to be disturbed until morning. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He glanced at his watch and saw it was midnight on Christmas Day. He tried to hide the sigh that escaped him and managed to hide it nicely behind a yawn. Whoever's idea this had been to hold a Christmas Eve confessional was beyond him, but so far it had netted very few sinners past 10 o'clock. Father Maxey had so far spoken to 2 drunks, parishioner Matthew, who believed that folding his sister's underwear was a sin, and a pervert who wanted to breathe heavily until he left a sinful mess in the box. Maxey had hoped the pervert would be the last, but this man had come in and ruined his celebration. "Father, are you there?" "Yes, my son," he said in a strained voice. "Speak your sin and I'll listen. This night I did break into a house without consent." Father Maxey nodded. He was often privy to crimes, both the black and the less serious. He'd heard more than one good Catholic who'd admitted to coveting his neighbor's flat screen this week. He usually kept such sins to himself, but last year, when that crying man had admitted to defiling all those children, he'd been forced to go to Detective O'Shaughnessy, another good Catholic. Sins were one thing, but Father Maxey was not the sort of priest to let child molestation continue, as the diocese could attest. This fellow, though, would likely be sent on with a few Hail Marys and a Merry Christmas. "Very well, my son. 12 Hail—" "I'm not finished, Father. I can't go to the police with this story, and I know that you've always been a good boy who will know what to do with this information." Good boy. That phrase took him back a little. Father Maxey, a priest well into his 40s, hadn't been a boy in many years. "Continue, my son. I will listen." "Well, I came in, I went to the tree, and began my work. I was half done, and there were so many presents, you understand, when I heard a noise upstairs. I ignored it at first. With 3 children in the home, someone was likely to be a light sleeper, but as I worked, the noise became louder. I finally recognized it for what it was, and the sound made me curious and a little worried. It was a child who was crying." Father Maxey leaned closer to the rectangle grate at the confession booth. Despite the hour, the stranger's story had drawn him in. Through the shadowy hole of the confession booth, Father Maxey could see an old man with a white beard and a bald head. He had a cap in his hand, and a garish red coat that looked damp with snow. Though his eyes were downcast, Father Maxey could tell that he was crying. There was a smell in the booth again, something detectable only as an afterthought. Peppermint, maybe, with an underlying smell of horse stall or barn floor. I went upstairs to have a look. Sometimes I do happen upon scenes of a less than cheery nature, and I thought I might do some good for a needy child. When I reached the landing, I immediately knew that something was wrong. A dog was slumped at the top of the stairs. I thought he was sleeping at first, but when I touched him, his head flopped to the side to show me that his neck was broken. Rascal was never a very good watchdog. I'd given him treats more than once to quiet him while I was there, and his friendliness had finally gotten the better of him. Then I heard the noises again and turned my attention to the children's room. Maxey was silent on the other end of the grate, held fast by the stranger's story. He told his tale as though it was an episode of Law and Order, and as he spoke, Maxey almost felt as though he were there with him. He could see Rascal, a mutt with some German shepherd roots, lying on the floor with his neck snapped, and his friendly face still set in that eternal grin of slackening realization. The landing was dark, a nightlight spilling out the only light to be seen as the Christmas tree stood cheery sentinel below. He heard the whimper from the darkness, and turned his eyes toward the cracked door halfway down the hall. How was the stranger doing this? I crept, not wanting to spook anyone, if The child was just having a nightmare. But when I reached the door, I heard the sound again and knew it was no sleeping child. The sound I heard was waking terror, the fear too dark to vocalize, and now its owner must suffer in crippled silence as the monster falls upon him. I pushed the door open, not caring who heard, and found myself inside an abattoir. The room, you see, was small but big enough for 3 boys. 3 beds, each a different color and each with the boy's name stenciled on the front, stood in a line. The other half of the room was free for play. The floor was clustered with toys and games. 2 of the beds were occupied, but not with happy, smiling boys like I'd seen before. Some nights when I visit, I would peek in on them and see what dreams their faces painted. Each of them had always been a fresh canvas, a fine boy with Christmas morning prancing in his dreams. But tonight, it was very different. He fetched a deep sigh, and Maxie was afraid he might stop. He was invested now. He needed to know how it ended, no matter how terrible. Tonight, I saw that 2 would never dream again. Their blood was a garish red as it soaked into the sheets. Maxie gasped, unsure what sort of confession this was becoming, but knowing it was like to be terrible. These 2, however, were luckier than the 3rd. They'd been cut before they woke, and thus had expired without knowing the terror the 3rd now lived in. They were too old, you see. The monster I had interrupted only preyed upon the youngest of lambs. When I opened the door, I had inadvertently stumbled upon the blackest of tableaus. One was a child in flannel pajamas, smiling superheroes looking on in frozen acceptance from his top, as blood oozed from one arm, which he had raised to defend himself. The other, the object of his fear, was a haggard man dressed as Kris Kringle. His coat and face were red with blood. His beard was matted with it as though he'd been chewing someone up just seconds before, and over his head was held a long knife poised for the kill. He paused a moment as though to draw strength, and Father Maxie pulled in a frantic breath, his rapture too deep for breath. Another pause. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. On this night I didn't knowingly commit murder. I knowingly crushed that man's skull against the frightened child's headboard, and I cannot say that my act was only to save that child. I felt wronged, blasphemed against. That he would take my image to inspire such fear was, to me, monstrous. There, I've also committed idolatry, I suppose. I compared myself to God, of whom I am a so-called saint of. I suppose my crimes and my sin are threefold, then. But I would do it again, to remove such a monster from this world, before he could hurt another child." His words moved the priest, but also convinced him. Was this man crazy? Had he really been a home invader turned savior, or was he... "What is your name, my son? What name did your mother give you on the day of your birth?" "Nicholas, Father. I am called Nicholas." Father Maxie felt it hard to speak. His throat was tight with tears, and his mind was a stranger to him. "Given the circumstances, my son, 12 Hail Marys should do it. You may say them on your way, for you have a long night ahead of you, if I'm not entirely mistaken." "I do, Father," the man almost cried. When he faced the mesh rectangle, Father Maxie could swear that he felt a warmth radiating through it. For just a moment, he felt filled with a spirit he hadn't felt since he was a child. It was as though all those years and all those miles had been erased, and he had received a portion of his faith back this Christmas Day. His night was far from over, though. He heard the man leave the booth and felt moved to catch a glimpse of the old saint. much like the child he had been once, a child who had sat atop the stairs with his brother Aaron and waited all night to catch a glimpse. He wanted to see the man, to prove to himself that the Christmas spirit was flesh and magic. He threw the curtain aside, his face awash with rosy glow, but there was no jolly saint before him, no reindeer sleigh, no bag of toys or cheery elves, only a shivering, tear-streaked boy draped in a red coat. He had a large cut on his arm, just as the man had said he would, but was otherwise unharmed, for someone who would turn out to be the last victim of a serial killer called the Yuletide Carver. He'd killed 6 families that year, all of them killed in their beds, with the youngest child saved till last, before being brutally murdered. When the police arrived at the young boy's house later that morning, they found his dog, his parents, and his 2 brothers all dead in their beds. Their throats were slashed, and the weapon they found would match their wounds and the wounds of the other victims perfectly. The last body, the one dressed in a Santa costume that he'd likely stolen from the mall he'd been recently fired from, was found laid across the last bed, his skull caved in, the murder weapon clutched in his frozen hand. That would come later, though. For now, the priest bent down before the boy, like a penitent before the cross, and inspected his injuries. He wasn't hurt too badly. He had a long, jagged cut on his arm, but his eyes told the old priest that many of his injuries were below the surface. Maxie raised the child's face, a handsome and well-made face that would likely find little trouble finding a new home if none of his family could be found, and asked him about the man who'd saved him. It would be the statement in all the papers the next day. It would be the headline used by many to paint an end to the long night that had held the city for so long. It was Santa. The real Santa saved me. Mary was 6 when she first noticed the noises in the house. It all began like most childish things do, with fear. Laying in bed, she heard them in the walls and thought they were monsters. She would shrink underneath the covers and shudder at the scratching sounds that came from the wall and the ceiling of the old country house they lived in. Many nights, she would feel like she must surely shudder to death under her comforter. Mary would finally fall asleep with the sounds of scratching in her ears, and even then, she wasn't safe. She would have the worst dreams imaginable, dreams of monsters in the walls, with long claws and scabrous hands that drug their nails behind the walls. They were only looking for weak spots so they could come through and get her. Every morning when she woke up, Mary would say a little prayer and thank God for keeping her safe for another night. She would suffer like this for a whole month before finally meeting her monsters face to face and sleeping better the next night for it. Her dad had heard them too, it seemed. Mary found him in the laundry room one morning as she went to get a shirt for school, putting a glob of peanut butter inside a round plate. She sat and watched him for a moment, trying to figure out what he was doing, and when he looked back and found her lurking, he jumped a little in surprise. "Mornin', Squirt. You scared me half to death." "Mornin', Daddy. What are you doing?" He ruffled her hair and walked her out of the laundry room. "I'll show you when you get home from school. They should have noticed it by then." Mary went off to school, full of curiosity and wonder, and when she came home that afternoon, she went straight to the laundry room to check. The box was still there, and Mary heard something thrashing around inside. She was scared as she approached it, certain that the monsters from her nightmares would be inside and waiting for her to get close. As she peeked through one of the round holes in the box, Mary saw that it was nothing but a pair of fat brown rats. They became even more frantic when they saw her peeking. They started running and squealing around the little box, and as Mary watched them, she realized that they were just as scared as she had been. Mary didn't think about what she was doing when she opened the side of the box and let them scamper out. They didn't leave right away. They seemed to be trying to figure out whether Mary was tricking them or not. Eventually, their survival tendencies took over, and they left the box and ran behind the washing machine. Mary closed the box so that no other rats would scamper in, and went to the living room to watch cartoons. She was 2 hours into her afternoon cartoons when Dad came home and went straight to the trap. She heard him in there, grumbling confusedly as he looked at the sprung trap with no mice inside. In the end, her dad figured he'd been outsmarted and reset the box with more bait. Freeing his prisoners became an afternoon habit of Mary's. She would come home, make a snack, go see if any mice or rats were in the trap. They usually were. Some of them even looked like the same mice she'd seen from the day before. Every day she would turn them loose and watch them scamper off before closing the box and going to watch cartoons. She had stopped being afraid of the scampering she heard in the night, after learning that it was just the mice that she had been freeing. They were running and playing as though to thank her for helping them, and Mary went to sleep dreaming of happy mice playing hide-and-seek in the walls of the house. The week before Christmas, though, Daddy caught the magic mouse. That was also the day he caught her. She was out of school until after New Year's, and had gone from half a day of cartoons to a full day of cartoons. Both her brothers were out of the house, and Dad was out back chopping wood, when Mary heard a loud clang from the laundry room, and an ear-splitting squeal that cut through the sound of Huckleberry Hound like a knife through flesh. She jumped up from the couch and ran to the laundry room, wanting to see the big rat that Daddy had trapped. In that, she was not disappointed. The rat was huge, big as a kitten, and covered in long white fur that made its red eyes look fierce as they bulged from its head. Mary was hesitant to let this one go, given its size and fierce demeanor. It looked like it might be mean, but as she watched him through the holes in the trap, he did the last thing that Mary would have ever expected him to do. He talked. "Excuse me, child. Do you think you could let me out?" Mary started. Rats weren't supposed to talk. Not to people, at least. She couldn't do anything but stare at him as he stood on his back paws and used his front ones to rub at his nose and whiskers. When he didn't immediately speak again, Mary assumed that she had imagined it, letting her imagination run wild again. She started to stand up, ready to go back to her cartoons, when the rat spoke again. "Please, child, I'll do anything if you'll let me go." He had talked. Mary went down and peered at him again. He was still sitting there, front paws cleaning his face in a furtive little scamper. But his eyes were locked on Mary's. She knew that she hadn't imagined it this time. Her hands inched towards the lock, but stopped as they came in contact with the mechanism that would open the side. Mary looked at the rat distrustfully, and it stared back at her as she asked her burning question. You won't bite me, will you?" It laughed, and its laughter was high and strange. No, my dear, I wouldn't dream of it. If you release me, I'll owe you a favor." That was all the reassurance Mary needed. She opened the side of the trap, and the rat scuttled off on its clicky little paws. He stopped to look at her as he twitched his nose, seeming to smile as the two stared at each other. He was a very old rat, and his fur was long and white, like an old man's beard. He was missing a finger on his left paw, and his tail looked as though someone had chewed the end of it off. He rubbed his paws over his snout again in that strange way of his, and Mary thought he would surely speak again. In her wonder, she hadn't heard her father coming inside. "So you're the one who's been screwing up my trap," he said, and when she turned to look at him, Mary could tell that she had made a mistake. He loomed in the doorway, snow sliding off his thick jacket to puddle on the floor, and as the mouse ran for the hills, her father clamped a hand around Mary's arm and dragged her into the living room. When he was done, Mary didn't think she'd be able to sit down for a week, and when he told her mother, she found herself grounded from TV for the rest of winter break. Mary sulked as she sat in bed that night, her backside hurting almost as much as her ego. Her brothers had been no help when they'd come home. They'd only said that she shouldn't have been so stupid as to let Dad's rats out of the cage. "They're not supposed to be inside, you dummy. Dad's trying to get rid of them." This information hadn't helped, since Mary didn't want Dad to get rid of them. As they scampered through her ceiling that night, She thought about that sound disappearing forever and felt a fresh wave of tears. "Why are you crying, child?" Mary stifled a scream as she turned to see the old rat standing on her nightstand. His white fur stood out like a searchlight in the dark room, and Mary couldn't believe she hadn't seen him before. He was up on his hind legs, staring at her over his front paws, and he looked like a servant waiting for instructions. Dad's trying to get rid of you and your friends, and I don't want you to leave." "Nor do we, child. It's cold outside. Without shelter, my kind will die. I wish they'd leave you guys alone. I wish they'd just go away and not bother you guys anymore." They were childish words that Mary would come to regret. "My children and I owe you a great debt, young lady. Let me think of this and see if I might not be able to answer your wish." You could make my family disappear?" she asked, not daring to believe it. It would be just like the movies she'd seen with Mom and Dad a couple of nights ago, where the boy's family disappeared and he fought the burglars. This time, though, it would be for real, and not because they accidentally left without her. Mary could do whatever she wanted once they were gone, and no one would be around to stop her. It would be a Christmas dream come true, and Mary stared at the old rat with anticipation. The old rat seemed to contemplate before saying, "We shall see. Give me a few days to think it over, and I'll speak to you again." Mary fell asleep to the sound of his heavy paws leaving up the hallway. The next few days were full of excitement. Dad didn't catch anything in the trap. He'd put a lock on it to keep people out, and he seemed very upset about it. He'd started hearing them in the walls, making him very angry that he couldn't catch them. Mom seemed to be trying to take his mind off it, taking them out to see the lights or to Christmas events in town or just off spending time together as a family. All the while, Mary thought about her secret and her secret friends in the walls. In her mind, she would never miss her family once they were gone. She would never want them back, and if she did, her new rat friend could bring them back and make it all better again. Children can sometimes fail to realize the harsh realities of loss. She awoke 2 days before Christmas to find the rat on her nightstand again. "Excellent news, child! We have found a way to make your family go away." She started awake when his squeaky little voice cut through the night. She had been nearly asleep and rolled over to look at him when she heard his squeaky voice. His red eyes were fixed on her with an odd intensity, and in his hand was a little bag made of plastic, wound shut with a bread tie. He held it out to her with some reverence, and when she took it, Mary saw that it was full of powder. "Your mother has laid out the start of breakfast in the morning. What you must do is sneak downstairs and put this magic powder in the box she uses to make the cakes. Then, when they eat the powder, they will go away, and you will have your wish." Mary looked at the little bag. It was no bigger than a Barbie purse, and the powder inside made a dry, crunchy sound when she pressed it. The magic rat must have made the spell powder, she guessed. So Mary adding it must be part of the spell. She got out of bed and tiptoed down the hall, the old rat scampering behind her. She took the stairs very slowly so they wouldn't creak, skipping the third step on the landing as she jumped softly over it. The downstairs was very dark, the living room furniture looking squashy and spooky in the dim light. Mary glanced around nervously as she tiptoed, expecting Dad to lunge out and grab her any minute. As her bare feet touched the linoleum, she knew she was home free. The box of pancake mix was just where the rat had said it would be. Her mother had left it out along with biscuit mix, her mixing bowl, and a whisk. Mary opened the box of pancake mix and poured the magic powder like the rat had told her to. When the baggie was empty, she closed it back and turned to see the rat perched on the table as though he had been observing her. "Now, be certain that you don't eat anything at breakfast tomorrow. Otherwise, you'll disappear too," he warned. Mary made a mental note to sleep in tomorrow so she wouldn't be tempted by any of the yummy smells and slipped back into bed with a smile on her face. Mary knew that tomorrow her Christmas wish would come true. The smells of pancakes and bacon awoke Mary early the next morning. Her stomach growled as she smelled them cooking, but she rolled up in her blankets and tried to ignore it. She could hear her brothers getting up, running downstairs, jockeying to be the first to taste the bacon. She heard the smack and the ow as her mother smacked someone on the hand with a spatula and told them to go set the table. Mary smelled eggs, too, as her mother cracked them into the pan, and now her dad was lumbering out of bed and moving towards the stairs. Her mother told him to help set the table, and he called her name up the stairs before going to help her brother. A few minutes later, her dad knocked on the door and told Mary breakfast was ready. When she didn't stir, he did it again, and when she still didn't move, he just walked downstairs to join the rest of the table. "Oh well," she heard him grumble, "more for me." Mary hunkered under the covers. The moment she was waiting for had approached. They said grace, a low murmur as they all bowed their heads, and then the sounds of clinking forks and rattling plates began. Mary heard her brother talking about sledding today, Dad talking about finally finishing that surprise for someone in the barn, and Mom talking about some last-minute wrapping she needed to do. Her mother was just saying that she'd have to kick us all out of the house so she could finish, when she suddenly coughed in a wet, frightening way. Her dad asked if she was okay, but when she tried to say she was fine, one of her brothers started moaning, and Mary heard someone being sick all over the table. She was silent in her blanket cocoon, all the excitement lost. Was this what happened when people disappeared? Was this what disappearing people sounded like? She heard someone else being sick, and a chair crashing over as they fell. She thought it might be her dad, and when someone started screaming, she shuddered deeper into her blanket cocoon. There was the sound of breaking plates, someone falling to the floor and sobbing as someone was sick again and again. Her mother suggested that someone call an ambulance, but it was hard to make out as she vomited loudly. Mary heard Dad bellowing and thumping around, trying to get up from the table, before he fell hard to the floor and shook the whole house. Mary pulled her knees to her chest and waited for the sounds to be over, but they went on for much too long. The sounds of vomiting, crying, falling, breaking things, and the watery screams of her family took a long time to be replaced by silence, and in many ways, the silence was worse. The sounds didn't stop suddenly either. They tapered off, little by little, and when the last of the crying and dragging had stopped, Mary almost couldn't bring herself to move. Magic wasn't supposed to sound like that. In all the stories, magic just poofed people away. It didn't do whatever that was. She wanted to stay in her room forever, just crying and shaking. But as noon crept closer, her stomach began to growl, and Mary had to get up and use the toilet before her bladder burst. As she stood in the doorway to the bathroom, Mary felt her eyes straying to the head of the stairs. It was so quiet down there, much quieter than it had been earlier, and Mary wanted to know what was down there. She edged towards the stairs, feet feeling heavy, before peeking down the stairs. A sneaker-clad foot was just visible near the bottom. Mary wanted to go back to her room and crawl back under the covers, but she knew that she had to see what had happened. Mary knew that they hadn't disappeared like in a fairy story, and now she had to face whatever it was that had happened to them. The sneaker-clad foot belonged to one of her brothers, and after seeing him, she wished that she'd just gone back upstairs. Her brother was lying face down in a pool of blood in his own sick. He was reaching for something under the table, and as she looked, Mary realized that he was reaching for her mother's hand. Her hand stood out on the floor like a pale starfish, but unlike her brother, her back was against the floor, her face a terrible mask. Her mouth hung open, blood trickling from the corners, and her eyes were rimmed red with tears that stared into oblivion. When she'd fallen, she had taken most of the dishes on her side of the table with her, and her arms were covered in oozy cuts as she clutched the tablecloth in one stiff hand. Her other brother lay across the table, his blood staining the food with a dull, rusty red. Her dad had died on the way to the kitchen, his handprint against the linoleum grisly. They were gone. They had gone away. Just as Mary had wanted. As she curled herself into a ball and sobbed against her knees, the perpetrator of these goings-on appeared beside her. "Now, why are you crying?" he asked, almost haughtily. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Mary looked at him, and he must have seen something on her face, because he scampered back a few steps, just out of arm's reach. "I just wanted them to go away. I didn't want you to kill them." "Kill them? Kill them like they killed my children for generations. You don't think this is the first appearance of the trap, do you? Your grandfather taught your father well, and he caught many of us in that trap. Then he would toss us, trap and all, into the river to drown. I've seen countless of my kind go into the river and never come back out again. They went away, and now so have your parents." He got close again, seeing she was in no mood to snatch him, and delivered the final blow. "And I didn't kill them, my girl. You did." He had misjudged her, though. Mary was indeed in a snatching mood. The rat's eyes bugged out of his skull as she squeezed him, red spittle running from the corners of his mouth as she squeezed him to death. He bit down on her hand, screaming as he died, but Mary didn't stop until she heard his bones break. She held his limp form as she shook it, and as she lay with her family on the bloody floor, her eyes ran thick with tears. That's where they found her when the police broke down the door, lying amidst the bodies of her family, her Christmas gift giver still clutched in her hand. When you read this story, you may think that my punishment was fitting. When you read this story, you may believe that I got exactly what I deserve. But what you should remember is that my actions were the actions of a child, actions that were judged by someone of a near godlike stature and levied against an 8-year-old girl who may not have fully grasped the consequences of her actions. I believe I should have been punished. I even believe I should have been punished harshly, but I do not believe I should have been made to suffer for 30 years of my life over the actions of an 8-year-old girl. It sits even now on my mantelpiece, glaring at me like some disquieting idol, and even as I sit in my cold apartment, I can feel its hate. I'm rambling. Let me start at the beginning. When I was 7 years old, I had the worst year of my life. My mother died on Christmas Day after a long battle with cancer. My father was always at work, always busy, never had time for me, which meant my mother and I had always been close. When she'd gotten sick, I had immediately spent every waking moment I could at her side in the hospital. Dad was busy, too busy for his dying wife or his hurting daughter, and it was up to me to watch her slip away over the course of 9 months. I was there in her room when she died, pushed up against the wall as the doctors and nurses tried their best to revive her. By the time my father got there, I had been sitting and crying by my mother's deathbed for 2 hours. Mom had been my sole guardian, my staunch caretaker, and her absence had left me numb and spiteful. I was mad at many things in my life, but above all else, I was mad at Santa Claus. As children, we believed Santa to be some kind of all-powerful totem of the holidays. If you write a letter to Santa, he will bring you your heart's desire. He will make any wish a reality. As adults, we know better, but as children, we believe that Santa is the genie from Aladdin mixed with Jesus Christ himself, and his powers around the holidays are unwavering and unarguable. In my 7-year-old mind, if I had asked him to save my mother and he hadn't, then it was because he didn't want to. This turned me into a mean and spiteful 8-year-old. My father brought a new woman home, one of his secretaries from the office named Cindy. She was sleeping in my mother's bed, moving her things around, and replacing my mother in almost every way. Looking back through the lens of time, Cindy was a very nice lady, and if I'd given her a chance, she would have probably made a very good mother for me. Cindy cooked my meals, she cleaned the house, she tried her best to be my friend, and I gave her nothing but hate. My mother, The focal point of my life had died after all. To have this woman in her house, sleeping in her bed, even wearing her clothes, was an affront. I told her that she was worthless daily, told her that I hated her, told her that she would never even come close to being my mother, and in spite of all that, she tried to love me. They got married 6 months after my mother died. I spent the first 3 months of their marriage making their lives a living hell. I refused every meal Cindy made me. I destroyed any room I was left alone in, and then lied and said I had no idea how it had gotten that way. I went out of my way to be an inconvenience to her, telling her I needed things for school or would really like this one particular thing in my nicest, sweetest voice, and then disregard or right out refuse to take anything she brought back. Sometimes I would destroy the gifts she gave me right in front of her. When she got me a beautiful dress for fall, a dress I would actually have liked to have worn, I tore it to pieces as she and my father watched, and then stormed to my room and slammed the door. I knew, you see, that I was safe from punishment no matter what I did. Father never cared what I did, as long as I didn't do it in his office, and since Mother had always been responsible for the house and the children, he expected Cindy to take me in hand, a task she was unsuited for. Cindy was more prone to tears than screams in the face of my misbehavior, but something was happening that even I hadn't foreseen, and it changed my antics forever. In October, Cindy became pregnant. By November, it was official, and my father was ecstatic at the idea of another child. This confused me, because he'd never shown the slightest interest in me at any point. Cindy was immediately the center of his universe. He hired a maid to clean and cook and look after me. I don't remember her name, but we went through 3 maids by December because of my antics. I made their lives a living hell, and whatever my father was paying them was clearly not enough to put up with me. The last one, I think her name was Rosemary, didn't speak English, but had a way about her that told me she was not going to leave because of a brat like me. I can remember being picked up in those 2 large arms and carried to my room as I kicked and bit and screamed. She would deposit me on the floor and lock my door so I couldn't escape and ruin her work. She knew how the house worked too, it seemed, and she knew that my timeouts wouldn't be commented on by Cindy or my father. By December 1st, I'd had enough of Cindy and her constant attention. The baby only made me hate her more, and as people continued to shower her with attention, my hatred burned hotter and hotter. Rosemary started keeping a closer eye on me as Cindy's pregnancy continued, but she really needn't have bothered. I wasn't what you call a planner, and when my chance came, I almost missed it. Looking back on it as an adult, I realized just how cruel I was at that moment. Cindy wanted nothing but a child that would love her, something I was never going to do, and the baby was her way of making my mother's house a home as well. I couldn't have that. I was at the top of the stairs, playing with dolls, when Cindy started up with a basket of laundry. Normally that would be Rosemary's job, but the maid had caught a cold, and my father had given her the week off, so she didn't make Cindy sick. Cindy was not supposed to be doing chores. She was under strict orders to be taking it easy and not straining herself. But she was trying to pick up a little, so Rosemary wouldn't have such a heavy workload when she came back. She'd come tottering up the stairs, basket obscuring her view, and I suddenly had a plan to make this all go away forever. I picked up my Barbie dream car and placed it precariously on the top step where I knew she'd put her foot down. I was young, but don't think for a second that I was naive. I knew a fall down the stairs would likely kill her, and if it didn't, it would likely get rid of the baby forever. She was midway up when a voice in my head tried to talk me out of it. "You shouldn't hurt her. It's not okay to hurt people." My conscience always spoke to me in my mother's voice, but I was doing this for her. Couldn't she see that? "You're going to risk killing her and her baby because of something your father did?" I didn't care. I hated her too much. "You're going to get in a lot of trouble for doing it." That made me think for a moment, but by then, it was already too late. Her house slipper came down on the car, and I watched her fall backwards down the stairs with a loud scream. The clothes went flying everywhere, and as she fell, I saw her wrap her arms protectively around her belly. She curled in a ball as she fell, and when she hit the first step, I knew she'd broken something. She hit 3 more steps before coming to rest at the bottom, still hugging her stomach as she lay crying. the laundry basket covering her as she came to rest. There she lay in a puddle of clothes and carpet, and from my vantage point, I could see the first thin trickles of blood as they coursed from underneath. The ambulance arrived in time to save her. Dad had been at the office when Rosemary had called him. She had come running in about 5 minutes after Cindy had fallen and called the ambulance after making sure I was okay. She sat with Cindy at the bottom of the stairs, cradling her head and talking to her in that too-fast Spanish she always used when it was just the two of them. I sat at the top of the stairs, surveying my handiwork, but Rosemary wouldn't let me come down the couple of times I tried. Rosemary was never fooled about what had happened, and she always looked at me with secret knowledge the few more times we had reason to be together. Dad beat the ambulance home, but only just. He rode in the ambulance with Sydney, thanking Rosemary for coming over so suddenly, and left me with the housekeeper while he went to go see about his new wife and child. Rosemary started dinner, and I played in my room, and sometime later, after dinner I think, my father came home. He called both of us to the living room, giving Rosemary the honor of joining in the news, and filled us in on Cindy and the baby. He told us that Cindy was going to stay in the hospital for a while. She'd broken several bones and scraped her back up pretty badly, and had possibly injured her spine. The doctors weren't sure how badly she was hurt, but they did say that she had lost the baby. Rosemary cried a little, but I didn't. I had wanted this to happen, but now that it had, all I could feel was numbness. I had killed something. Not a bug or anything, but a real person, and I was no longer sure how I felt about it. I left before he was done talking, but he didn't seem to mind. How quickly things would change. Dad went to the hospital early the next morning. He was on his way out the door when I reminded him that he'd promised to take me to see Santa. It was a promise he had made days ago, a promise I believed he'd forgotten. But when I reminded him of it, I put enough whine on my voice to make it sound like it was something I'd been looking forward to. I knew there was no Santa, of course, back when I thought I knew so much, but I knew that the mall would be crowded and it would force him to spend time with me. At the end of the day, I guess all I wanted was my father to show me that he cared. He asked Rosemary to take me instead, and he went off to see Cindy in the hospital. We rode to the mall in the town car as a palpable silence hung between us. "What are you going to ask St. Nicholas for?" she asked conversationally. "There is no Santa Claus, silly. I'm too old to believe in such things." She was quiet for a few seconds, before, almost whispering, "You are very wrong." "What?" I asked, shocked out of my pouty huff. No adult had ever contradicted me, not even my mother, and to be contradicted by the help was just unthinkable. "I said you are very wrong. Just because you do not believe in something doesn't mean it isn't so. It matters not whether you believe in a thing or not, only whether or not it believes in you." She spoke matter-of-factly in her thick Spanish accent. I turned away, ignoring her and pretending she didn't exist. I was a spoiled brat, a naughty child that needed a lesson in how the world worked. I didn't know it then, but this lesson would begin sooner rather than later. This lesson would be the only lesson worth learning. We waited in line for an hour and a half. Rosemary had walked me to the middle of the crowded mall, shoppers moving to and fro and families laughing as they moved from shop to shop, all while Christmas music played in the background. Santa's stage had been set up in front of the big fountain in the middle of the mall, and it looked just as goofy and phony as it always did. There was a long snake of children that trailed away from it, curving around like a magic circle. Rosemary sat on a nearby bench and told me to stand in line. "I'm much too old to see him, but if you would receive his judgment, then you must wait." I fidgeted nervously as I waited, throngs of happy families crowding around me, and sighed as the line moved slower and slower. Why was I waiting in this line? I didn't believe in Santa Claus. If Santa was real, he'd have saved my mother. Even if I had still believed, this was just going to be some half-drunk fat guy they'd stuffed into a suit who smelled like kids' pee and barely talked. It was ridiculous to stand here and wait for my turn to sit on this old faker's lap. But despite that, I couldn't force myself to leave. Rosemary's words had somehow moved me, and it felt more like I was waiting for a confession than my turn on Santa's knee. When I finally neared the front of the line, I could see that my assumption had been wrong. This year's Santa was not a fat man with a cloth beard or some homeless man with a tangled mess of hair. He was dressed all in red, and his suit looked homemade as opposed to store-bought. His beard was a fluffy white bulge of soft-looking hair, and on his round little nose sat a pair of tiny spectacles. His boots looked old and battered, his face was a patchwork of laugh lines, and he practically oozed with good cheer and holiday spirit. The elves, teenagers usually dressed in green smocks and pointy shoes, had been replaced with actual little people, and their costumes were perfect to the last detail, from their pointy shoes to their pointy ears. The whole crew made a jolly, happy scene, and I didn't see one child act scared or unsure of the laughing stranger. When it was my turn, however, the mood seemed to change. The elf who came to get me took one look at my face and almost sneered. His happy, laughing face seemed something almost contemptuous, and as he led me to the jolly old man, I was affixed with the laughing eyes and greeted by the rosy voice. But his face changed as the elves had. He wasn't mad. I saw no anger on his face, but he became almost mournful, disappointed. He allowed me into his lap, and I was surrounded by the smells of old cinders, gingerbread, the woodsy animal smell of reindeer, and freshly fallen snow, but his eyes were still that of a disappointed parent. It was as though he were ashamed to see me in my current state. "Hello, Abigail." How do you know my name?" I said, startled for a moment. He smiled that slightly troubled smile and answered, "Because I'm Santa Claus. It's my job to know all the children." "Of course," I said, sighing a little. "If this guy wanted to play his part, then I'd play along, I guess. Well then, you probably know what I want for Christmas already." "I do, but I know you're only getting one thing this year." I laughed. I couldn't help it. He was just so full of crap. My tree at home was stacked with presents, and I knew enough to know that everything I'd asked Dad for was there. This man didn't know me after all, then. If I wanted something, I got it, and that was all there was to it. I wondered briefly if Rosemary had told him to scare me a little. He pressed a small box into my hand then. "I have a present for you, something very special. It's something we only give to certain children." It was a small red box with a simple bow on top. It was about the size of a ring box, and when I touched it, I could feel a small electric charge run through me. I nearly dropped it, but I managed to hold on to it as my surprise turned into malaise. A token gift with no real meaning from a mall Santa with no real power. Yes, I'm sure it's wonderful and unique, and I won't see a dozen or so of them in the parking lot on the way out," I said as I hopped off his lap. "Merry Christmas, Santa," I said as I walked back towards the exit. "Merry Christmas, Abigail," he said, almost too low for me to hear, and then he was off greeting the next child as I left. I didn't open the box that day. I honestly forgot about it until Christmas Eve, and though I must have seen it under the tree 1,000 times, I didn't remember bringing it out of the car. Rosemary was silent on the car ride home, but she kept shooting glances at my present, and then looking away quickly before she thought I would notice. She probably expected me to rip it open and see what Santa had given me, but I didn't care what it was. I kept thinking back on the whole experience and couldn't help but feel unnerved. He had just been a mall Santa after all, but something about him had seemed like more than that. He had almost seemed like the real Santa to me. The days came and went. Dad spent more and more time at the hospital with Cindy, something that he'd never done for Mom, and Rosemary and I found ourselves more and more often spending time together at the house. We didn't suddenly become friends or anything, but many afternoons were spent with me on the couch watching TV and her in the kitchen cooking or cleaning the house and singing to herself. She was a patient woman, Rosemary, and after a few days of making life hard for her, I stopped completely. I would just sit listlessly on the couch or lie on my bed and read, and now it almost seems like I was waiting for something to happen. On Christmas Eve, something did. Rosemary was staying the night, Dad at the hospital with Cindy as usual, and if she hadn't been there, I would likely be dead. The fire marshal's report says that at 1:35 a.m., the outlet plugged into the tree shorted out and set fire to the large pile of presents beneath it. Rosemary was asleep in the guest bedroom when the fire started, and upon smelling the smoke, she woke me up, and the two of us left the house as the living room blazed. We dialed 911 from the neighbor's house, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. Rosemary and I watched the townhouse burn down, watched the house collapse in on itself, and watched in silence as everything I'd ever known was consumed. I lost everything that night. My clothes, my pictures of Mom, the dresser she had made me, all the cards she'd written me, all the books she'd ever read to me as I drifted off to sleep. All of it was ash in the December wind, and when Rosemary wrapped me in a hug, I didn't feel capable of returning it. I was in shock for quite some time, and when they brought me to the hospital, my father finally came to check on me. He didn't stay long once the doctor told him I was unharmed, which left Rosemary and I alone in the ER room. The police and the firefighters came to talk to me then. The fire was deemed an accident, and everything in the house a complete loss. These weren't the words they used with me, of course. They were sympathetic and told me the local charity was collecting clothes, food, and toys for my family in our time of need. One of the firefighters also told me with a smile that not everything had been lost in the fire. He reached into his coat and handed me a small package that had been sitting under the tree for nearly a week. The small red package with the simple bow that the mall Santa had pressed into my hand. I held the box for a while. It was completely undamaged by the fire. Not even the shiny ribbon used to make the bow had been burned. But when I looked at it, I already knew this was no normal gift. Rosemary was looking at me as I held it, and she seemed to know too what I would find when I opened the box. "Might as well open it, child. Holding off won't make it any better." Inside the box was a simple lump of coal. I've had it tested several times over the years. It's a lump of pure coal, unrefined, unproduced, made with what I now think must be pure magic. It left no stains inside the box. It left no residue on my hands. And over the years, I found it to be indestructible. It was the only thing I received that Christmas, and, to be honest, it was enough. My life was never the same after that day. Cindy was brought to our new home in January. It wasn't as grand as our old house, not even close, but it was ours. Father's time at the hospital had meant that his business had suffered, and so did his finances. Cindy's medical stay was costing him a fortune, so she had had to come home. My medical expenses were costing him quite a lot, and I hadn't stayed long in the hospital either. Rosemary still cooked and cleaned, but Father seemed always on the verge of firing her. He didn't want to. He felt she had changed his daughter somehow, but we simply didn't have the money to pay her. Cindy needed Rosemary, however. Cindy was still nearly catatonic, even after weeks in the hospital. Something had snapped in her after losing the baby, and now she did little more than stare at the wall or soil herself. She would take food if you fed her, and she would drink water if you dribbled it on her mouth, but she didn't move, and she wouldn't talk. Rosemary would often sing to her, something soft in Spanish, as she combed her hair or bathed her, and Cindy seemed to like it when Rosemary was there. It didn't matter, though. Rosemary had bills to pay, and ultimately needed a job as much as anyone. 2 weeks after Cindy came home, Father had to let Rosemary go. I met her at the door and begged her to stay. I had come to like her in the time after the fire. We had come to an almost friendly place. My rage and anger seemed meaningless now, and I didn't want her to leave. She was often the only person in the house who seemed real to me, alive, and without her, the house would seem so empty. She bent down on one knee and favored me with a smile. "I know things seem hard now, but you must be strong. You have no idea how much worse things will become." "How do you know?" I asked, no anger in my words, only a child's terrible curiosity. Rosemary closed her eyes then. "When I was a girl, I had a younger sister named Maria. She was so beautiful, and everyone loved her. I was so very plain-looking, common, and I was angry that my little sister got so much more attention than me. So one day, I pushed her into a well. She drowned in that well, drowned as I stood and watched. And when they found her, they asked me what I knew. I told Father I knew nothing, and it was believed to be an accident. That Christmas I received my own red box, and..." She reached into her apron then and pulled out a large black rock, just like the one I had upstairs in my room. "I received my punishment from him. My father's livelihood was his farm and his ranch, and in the next year I saw his cows die of sickness. A flood killed my mother and siblings. His crops dwindled and his money dried up. By the end of his life, he was a hired hand for a rancher who had been his greatest rival, and after a horse threw him and killed him, I left for America with nothing but the clothes on my back.
I do what I can now, in my old age, to make amends for the sins of my youth. You must do the same." I never saw her again after that, but she had been right. My father couldn't turn his business around and was forced to sell his assets. With no one to take care of her, I was forced to be Cindy's caregiver, and I tried my best to use it as an opportunity to make amends for what I'd done. Father sank into depression and started drinking. Who would blame him for drinking, I suppose? He was a failed businessman, a dead first wife, a cold daughter, and a current wife who was little better than a vegetable. He would fly into rages, and when he did, no one was safe from his screaming mouth or his flailing fist. I could forgive him the drinking. I could forgive him his rages. But the night he climbed into my bed when I was 13, I decided I would never forgive him for that. 3 years later, I would leave home forever, unable to take the abuse any longer. The coal, however, followed me. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it would always be waiting for me, a reminder of my sins. It's been 20 years now since that Christmas. I live in a dingy apartment with neighbors who are either too stoned or too wrapped up in their own problems to notice me. I've never had a job longer than a year, or a relationship that didn't end with me filing a police report. I've been banned from the local mall, several local malls, many times for many reasons, but the most common one is accosting mall Santas, looking for the real one amongst the imposters. I've never found him. I've never found anyone but the sots or the creeps I spoke of when I was in my childish absurdity. I do see him sometimes, though. It's always in December, always as the first snow falls. I'll be on the street, walking to work, or just walking to get out of my apartment, and there he is on the other side of the street, or at the end of the block. He's dressed in the same red suit and cap, the same scuffed old boots, and the same little glasses perched on his nose. He never says a word, just lays a finger on the side of his nose, and smiles his sad smile at me. I always run to him, always try to get to him before he disappears, but when I'm done dodging traffic or knocking people out of my way, he's always gone, and I'm always left crying as people stare at me like I might be crazy. While the cold does curse my life, it also gives me one gift, if you can call it a gift. When I was 13, right after my father slipped into bed with me for the first time, I waited until he was asleep and walked to the cabinet where I knew he kept his gun. I took out his revolver, made sure it was loaded, and put it to my temple. If he'd done it once, I knew he'd do it again, and I wasn't going to live in a home where that was my life. I closed my eyes that were dry as the desert, and steeled myself to pull the trigger. The cylinder turned and the hammer fell, but the gun did not report. I pulled the trigger 5 more times, but nothing happened. I put fresh bullets in the gun and tried again, but nothing happened. Finally, I just put the gun away and slept on the couch. When I was 15, I tried to jump off the roof of the house. I jumped head first from the roof over the driveway. I wanted my death to be assured. I didn't want to wake up in the hospital with a broken neck and no way to escape my father. Cindy was still alive then, still catatonic, but still alive. And though my death would leave her at his mercy, I couldn't find it in myself to care anymore. I just wanted the hurting to stop. I came to on the lawn with a sore back and a scraped up bottom. I've tried many other methods through the years, but none of them work. Someone always finds me, something always fails, the ambulance always gets there in time, my life is always saved. Whatever magic the coal has that ruined my life also helps preserve it. Of this I'm quite sure. Whatever lesson I am learning from my sin is one that will go on for a good long time. I'm writing this tale in hopes that it might save others from my fate. Let your children know, let your friends know, that the songs aren't just songs. We threaten our children with coal, but we don't understand it. We have forgotten that Santa doesn't just reward the just. We sing the songs about how he sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake, but we have forgotten that these things are fact. The coal sits on my desk as I write this, a black-hearted reminder of the hasty actions of a child. And no matter what I do, it follows me forever. So never forget that which sees you when you're sleeping. Remember always that he knows when you're awake. For he knows when you've been bad or good. So be good, for goodness sake. As the coal burns, the coal gives heat. So too does the heat destroy. Coal can sustain a fire, and a fire can be a tool of destruction. As you act in haste, so too does the fire, and never doubt that his fire will scour that which you hold dear. So when you lay down to sleep, pray for only the joys of Christmas. Pray for peace and goodwill towards men. Pray that you never feel the jagged edge of coal in your stocking.
December is a time of cheer and goodwill for most of the world. People exchange gifts, sing songs, houses are decorated, big meals are eaten with friends and family. Molly didn't learn about any of this until she left the village. She'd spent her first happy year away from home, getting odd sidelong stares and hearing repressed mumbles as she asked about their preparations and inquired about their sacrifices. No one seemed to know him, which filled Molly with hope. No one knew what it was like to live in the shadow of his fear, which made Molly hope that she had escaped him. 10 years later, Molly had a home of her own, with a husband to keep her warm on cold nights, and children to fill her heart with joy. She'd worked hard to leave behind all the traces of her old life, moved to America, found a place where she could forget the darker things that still lurked in the old world. Molly's home was covered in lights every December, snowmen standing sentry on the lawn, and her home was filled with the smells of cakes and cookies and the laughter of happy children. It was Christmas Eve again, and Molly was hard at work in the kitchen. Jake was 10, Hannah 6, and Molly had been baking and cooking all day in preparation for tomorrow's dinner. Joseph's family would be coming over to exchange presents, and she wanted this meal to be the best yet. The children were preparing for bed, brushing teeth and washing faces, and as the last of their preparations went into the stove, Molly sat down and sighed happily. Everything was done. Everything was ready. And now it was time to relax before Joseph came home and, "Mama, we're ready for our story." Molly sighed, but it was a happy sigh. She'd forgotten about the time. She scratched the bandage on the back of her hand as she made her way to the back of the house. The blood stains on it stood out a little, and when Joseph asked her about it, Molly had told him that she'd burned her hand on the stove. Maybe, she thought, she should tell him what had really happened. The more Molly thought about it, the more she knew that she wouldn't know where to begin. The children were nestled all snug in their beds when Molly arrived, and she took her seat in the big wooden rocker in the middle of the room, asking them what story they wanted to hear. "Three bears?" she asked. "Mama, that's a baby story," Hannah exclaimed, with deep indignation. Mickey Mouse Christmas, maybe?" "Pfft, that book's lame," Jake said, making full use of his new big kid attitude he seemed to have acquired when he turned 10. "Well, what do you want to hear?" Molly asked, rubbing the bridge of her nose as she felt a headache developing. "We want to hear a scary story," said Jake. I want to hear a Christmas story," said Hannah, "that's maybe a little scary." Molly tried to quash her frustration. She was just thinking that she didn't know any scary Christmas stories, but she realized that wasn't true. Molly knew an absolutely terrifying Christmas story, a story that was made all the scarier because it was true, a story made all the more frightening because Molly had lived it. "You want a scary story, do you?" she asked, both leaning forward beneath their covers. "I've got a scary story, if you'd like to hear it." Molly asked the question coyly, knowing they would want to hear. Her children were not the children Molly had grown up with. They were not children of the cold and snow. They wanted to be scared, but they had no clue what genuine fear was. They didn't know what it meant to shiver in the corner as you hear the green one tromp down the street. They'd never felt the terrible cold that signaled the end of someone you loved. Molly prayed they never did, but maybe a taste wouldn't hurt them too badly. Molly almost felt the cold creeping up her legs as she began, returning to a time when she had known the fear she hoped to instill. Mama's not from here. Unlike Daddy, Mama was not born in this great country. Once, she lived in a town called Ingsfield. Ingsfield was a small farming town, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We had no cars, no phones, no televisions, and our lights came from the candles and the fire we cooked over. Our town was a simple one, our ways just as simple, and that was how we liked it. When autumn began, we began preparing for his arrival. "Whose arrival, Mama?" Hannah asked, her voice a little excited. "His arrival," Molly intoned. "The coming of the Winter Lord." "Whose—" "Hush, children, and listen." Hannah fell silent again, and Molly continued. Harvest was always a time of celebration. The whole town worked together to bring in the bounty of the farmland. The livestock were brought from the fields, and knives were sharpened in preparation for the slaughter. The meat was salted and packaged for storage. Food was stored and canned and placed in cellars for the long winter ahead. And then, when everyone was set aside for winter, we put our excess together and prepared the end of autumn feast. On the last week of what you would call November, we held an autumn fair. It was always held on the village green, a long few acres near the town hall, and was always highly anticipated. There was music at the bandstand, dancing on the pavilion, tables laid with food and drink, games for children, prizes to be won. The celebration went on for a week. Some people celebrated all 7 days and only slept when their bodies demanded it. The people seemed to dance and play all the joy and warmth out of themselves during that week. Many knew that the next 4 months would be hard, knew that they might not see another autumn festival, so they lived a whole year in 1 week, and the whole town seemed to shrink when it was over. On December 1st, we began to feel the real chill of winter. That was when we built the altar. They were both wide-eyed now, their questions squashed for the moment. She drew them in with her story, painted a picture of idyllic life she'd once known, and now came the time for the real story to begin. It was time to show them a place where Santa Claus didn't stop, a land where Christmas trees brought no joy. These symbols would not save you from the Winter Lord, and it was time they knew what waited in the cold and the gloom. The town of happy revelers changed overnight. Now, happy faces red with drink became somber and knowing. They went to the quarry and brought the altar stone, the stone they'd used many and many a, still red with the dried leavings of last year's unfortunate chosen. They spent the week stacking stones and adjusting them just right, so their shape would please him when he came. After a week of stacking and preparing the altar, the offering was chosen, and the contents inspected. The Lord's offering, the last crop planted that year, was harvested, and the vegetables and grain were inspected for flaws that might anger him. Once that was done, 2 calves were chosen and brought forth to be inspected for defects and weaknesses. These were usually the 2 calves who'd taken home the best in show at the autumn fair, and their owners always looked sad, knowing that those 2 would never grow to adulthood, would never know the fear of the sharpened knives next year. Only then, after these things were chosen, did the town choose the real sacrifice. They were shivering now, and why not? Could Molly not feel the coldness in the room? That frigidity couldn't be dispelled by a fire or blanket. Its coldness was an old one, as old as time and as bleak as the tundra. It had been felt by the first man who shivered in his cave on a winter night. It was the coldness that man felt when the Winter Lord came to his cave and offered him a better way, a darker way. Cold as they were, Molly had their attention. Both were huddled beneath their blankets, shuddering from either cold or fear, but they could not look away. She saw that Hannah wanted her to stop, wanted it all to stop, before the story got really scary. Molly could also tell that Jake wished he had never asked for a scary story at all. There was magic in this tale that neither had ever known, making it all the more tantalizing. But they would know of him, even if the knowledge drove them mad in its knowing. The townspeople never chose their sacrifice. They would not have had the nerve to cut their own flock. The mark always chose for them. The mark would appear on the door of the sacrifice, a circle of blood with 3 slashes through it, and the sacrifice would feel it burned into their skin on the back of their hand one night as they slept. Its appearance was unquestioned by any and all, though some sacrifices did claim falseness. I remember the mark being contested only once, and the man's protest made little difference. He owned the biggest farm and the most land within the village. He claimed that his son had made the mark so the father would be put out of his way and his inheritance would be had. His son claimed no part in this, but it mattered not. The farmer had been chosen in the traditional way, and thus he was locked away until the night of the sacrifice. He screamed when that night came, but his screams didn't last long. Some went quiet, some went screaming, but they always went the same way. They went with the cold. At sunset, the snow began to blow in. Sometimes the snow would come before him, but the snow that preceded him was always thick and unforgiving. Snow from the mountaintops that killed if you stayed in it too long. The snow blew and the wind howled, and as the darkness settled over the town, we heard him approach. He came a horse, the steel-shod hooves cutting through the ice as it solidified on the dirt streets of our small town. I remember peeking one year when I was tiny, before my mother saw me and pulled me beneath the sill. I saw him, mounted on his horse. His skeletal horse was thin as a rail, its legs like sticks with frost for skin, and its eyes shone red with the fires of hell as its mane of shadow rippled like thistle from its scaly head. As terrible as he was beautiful when put against his rider. His rider, the Winter Lord, the Green Man, he who accepts the flesh. Though he was man-shaped, that was where the resemblance ended. He came dressed in armor of the deepest forest green, a cape of blue trailing behind him. His cape was ragged, covered in old red stains and stiff with frost, and as it trailed out, you could hear the ice on it break as it snapped in the wind. He held a 2-handed axe in one clawed hand, and whether those claws were armor or his own hands, no one knew. The axe was monstrous, its edge ever dripping with the blood of his victims. He held it down at his side, so it dragged the snow and left a red trail behind him. On his head sat a helmet topped with magnificent antlers, and charms and sigils of unknown meaning hung from those horns. No one had ever seen his face and lived. He kept it hidden beneath his helmet, but his eyes were as red as his horse's. If they fell upon you and met your own, he would raze your hovel to the ground and seek out your bloodline until it was expunged from the earth. He came to town on the 24th of December, a day which had some significance for him. With him came a mighty blizzard. It would cover the town and hide his deeds from sight as he went about his business. There were some who held the idea that he took pity upon the sacrifice and took them back to his realm to be his guests. There were those who believed that those he took would stay in the court of Queen Mab, Fairy Queen of Winter, who must be the ruler of this Winter Lord, and thus his master. Those with hovels close to the altar, those like my family, had no such illusions. Sometimes you could hear them screaming and begging over the wind and hail. Sometimes you could only hear the metallic slap of the axe as he went about his butcher's work. When the storm ended, All that was left was fresh blood upon the altar. All else was taken, never to be seen again. "No way," Jake whispered, but he didn't sound so sure. "You doubt your mother's words?" Molly asked, feeling the old ways of speaking coming back to her. "There's no way this kind of thing could happen. Someone would hear about it and put a stop to it. Plus, why don't they leave? This winter guy probably wouldn't follow them, right?" She smirked at him. "The people knew what the sacrifice brought them, Jake. If they appeased the winter lord, then the winter only lasted 4 months, and was mellow in the months before spring. With spring would come such a bounty of crops, and on the years when the sacrifice was good, the crops were the best they had ever been. He only took one person. A fair trade for a year of peace and a bountiful harvest, they would say. I, too, said it. I said it for 16 years, until my own time came." Your time?" Jake asked, but he knew what his mother meant. "Until the mark appeared on my door, until the brand appeared on my hand." My mother cried, and my brother offered to hide me, but my father was staunch in his resolve. "The mark cannot be argued. You will go to the council hall and wait for his coming." I spent that week in the mayor's house, awaiting my fate. A dress of snow white was made for me, a garland of green steel forged for my head. Upon my feet were slippers of the softest doeskin, and I just knew they would pinch when I put them on. Many believed that if the sacrifice was female, and the winter lord found her beautiful, he might take her to his castle in the mountains and make her his queen of winter, where she might live out her days as his consort and wife. The blood on the altar screamed of their stupidity, but the lies we tell ourselves are often the coziest. I did not need to be dragged to the stones when my time came. I walked up the street, mud squelching against my shoes, as the townspeople watched me with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "We are sorry for your sacrifice, but it must be. Death for you, life for our crops," that look said. Had I not looked at the sacrifice just that way? Had I not known that the mark might appear on my own hand one day? I had been selfish in all those years. I had taken of the town's well, and now it was my time to give. I mounted the altar as the sun began to sink, but despite my assuredness, I didn't feel selfish. Why should I give up my life? I asked myself. Because it was tradition? Because it was expected? Because it had always been? I began to see what I had never seen in the years of living in the town. Why did we give him what he wanted? Why did we let him take? Why didn't we just say no? As young as I was, I shouldn't have been so naive. When the sun began to set, the snow blew up out of nowhere, and the wind only pushed it in my face. I could hear the clomp of his horse as he came on, and as I squinted into the blowing wind, I could make out his antlered helm as he approached the altar. His axe made a sharp sound on the cobbles as he neared, and when he stopped before me, I could see him staring at me from under the visor of his helmet. He hadn't yet raised his axe, and from my vantage point, he seemed to be waiting for something. He was staring at me, his red eyes holding disbelief, and I saw my opportunity at that moment. I jumped from the altar, snow and ice battering me on all sides, and ran towards the woods. He screamed into the gathering night, and his voice sounded like the howl of an angry east wind. He came after me, hooves thundering steps behind me, but as I entered the woods I was ready for him. I'd played in these woods all my life, and I knew it would be impossible for a horse, even a horse as thin as his, to move quickly amongst the tightly packed trees. The forest flowed around me in a long brown blur, and I heard him roar as he realized he couldn't just ride me down. I heard his axe slap futilely into a tree as I ran, but I didn't stop to see what he was doing. I ran and ran until I found a burrow in the bottom of an ancient tree. I sank into it, ignoring the roots and spider webs that nestled there. I spent that night shivering amongst the bitter cold. As I shivered, I heard something I had not expected to hear. I heard the screams of the town as he laid it to waste. Other people ran into the woods, but took no notice of my hiding place. They ran like frightened rabbits, certain he would be behind them, but I knew better. They would die of cold, likely I would too. But as I pulled at the crunchy leaves that the hollow had swallowed up, I felt surer and surer that I would survive. I bided there till morning, the screaming dying out in the wee hours, and when I awoke, I was homeless and an orphan. I returned to the town long enough to get my things and leave. The houses were destroyed, hollow husks that would sit silent forever. The few people who still abided there looked at me with sullen eyes full of hate. They wanted to hurt me, wanted to kill me, but these sheep had stood by as their friends and family were taken by that winter night. I knew they would not raise their hands against me, and when I left for good. "What did you do then, Mama?" asked Hannah, her lip trembling as my story finally ended. "I met your father 6 months later. He was backpacking through Europe and took me as another backpacker. I'd been homeless for the last 6 months, scrounging food and looking over my shoulder for him. When he offered to let me come with him, I accepted. By the time we reached London, we were in love. And when he brought me to America to meet your grandparents, we were already planning to be married. That's how I came to be in America. That's how I came to escape the place of my birth." She let them sleep then, kissing their foreheads and turning off the light. Molly could hear them rolling in their beds, their dreams filled with ice. A fitful sleep was better than nothing, though. Molly sighed as she came into the living room. She hadn't told them everything, of course. How could you tell children everything? Sometimes the truth only brings fear. Molly took off the bandage and looked at the burn on the back of her hand. The circle with 3 slashes through it was as plain as it had been on the night she was to be sacrificed. Its meaning was as clear now as it had been then, too. He was coming for his lost sacrifice. She went to the window and looked out into the backyard. Molly could see him there, mounted on his ice horse, staring at her balefully with his piercing red orbs. He stood between the children's swing set and the wooden play fort they'd gotten last Christmas, looking as out of place as an altar stone at an autumn festival. 10 years was a long reprieve, she reflected, and as Molly stood holding his gaze, she knew what must be done. Joseph wouldn't understand, and the kids would be devastated, but maybe her sacrifice would stop them from being involved. As Molly opened the sliding door on the back porch, she felt the winter blizzard kiss her face as it had on that night 10 years ago. He walked his horse towards her, and as the axe came down, Molly knew there would be no throne of winter for her. She spread her arms and welcomed him to his sacrifice. Molly welcomed winter as her people had for generations, with blood and resolve.